However, one of the most vivid, poignant examples of God's sovereignty that I could find in Scripture was about Jesus himself, where Jesus himself acknowledged the sovereignty of God during one of the most crucial and most painful, awful experiences of his life. And that was leading up to his crucifixion. In the Gospel of John, chapter 19, verses 10 through 11, Pontius Pilate said to Jesus, "Don't you realize I have power either to free you or to crucify you?" This is Jesus' answer. "You would have no power over me if it were not given to you from above." Just think about that for a moment. The very pinnacle, or the very peak of our faith, the reason that any of us profess to be Christians and be called children of God, was a direct assertion of God's sovereign control. Oftentimes, we look and see how God was sovereign in Jesus' life, and we think, wow, that's great, that's amazing to see how God worked in Jesus' life. Yet, we have a really difficult time accepting it in our own lives. Just in the example I gave you of my mom's passing, I learned that we have to trust God in those times for His goodness, in His goodness. Whatever the calamity, whatever the pain, the trial that we're going through, we can know that God the Father has a loving purpose for us. Even though whatever we're going through is very, very difficult, we know that He has a perfect purpose, even though we may not be able to understand and see exactly what that is. In the book of Isaiah, chapter 38, verse 17, Hezekiah said this, "Surely it was for my benefit that I suffered such anguish." And Jeremiah, when he wrote in Lamentations chapter 3, he said, "Though he brings grief, he will show compassion. Great is his unfailing love, for he does not willingly bring affliction or grief to the children of men." So again, the first point that we've talked about is God is completely sovereign in good times and in bad. No matter what we're going through, He is completely sovereign and in control. Point number 2. God is infinite in His wisdom. God is, we all know that He is wise, but it's beyond our ability to even begin to comprehend. We just have no way to fathom His wisdom. The question, though, is that do we really believe that? Do we view God's wisdom and how He thinks in the same way that we think? And I would dare say that most of the time we do. We just naturally tend to push God into the same box that we have ourselves. And the Apostle Paul in Romans 11:33 said this, "Oh, the depths of the riches of the wisdom and knowledge of God! How unsearchable His judgments and His paths beyond tracing out." This is a truth that we have to acknowledge. You must acknowledge if we're going to trust God. If God's wisdom is no greater than ours, then we're in trouble. And there's really no peace. There's no ability to trust God in that situation. God's plan and the way that He works that plan are just beyond our ability to understand, and we just have to acknowledge that. There's no way that we can explain it. But this is one of those truths that I many times have had a hard time dealing with. In fact, when I was going through the situation of with my mom, if I could count the number of times I heard cliche Christian speak type statements like, "God is at work even if you don't think that," or if you don't see that. "Someday you'll look back and understand what God is doing in your life right now." Well, at the time, and even at times now, I still have a hard time with that. And I think that we have to be honest about that. Even though those statements most of the time are true and well-intended, you have to agree with me that there's something that's just annoying. Even though people have the best intentions, when people don't understand what you're going through. But nonetheless. The bottom line for us is this. Do we believe that God's wisdom is infinite and way beyond us? Are we willing to humbly accept this truth in our lives? I know it's hard. It very much is. But I want to talk just a moment. I mentioned understanding God and His wisdom. I want to talk about our understanding versus God's peace. I want to be just straight away with this and very honest and just up front and say that understanding or enlightenment does not equal peace. Okay? Just because we understand something does not necessarily give us peace. How many times in our lives have we heard things like, if I just knew more, or we've said these things, if I just knew more, if I just had more details, if I could just have a little bit more information, then I would understand. But really, if we understood, would that still give us the peace that we really desire? But I'm here to say that God has a different approach. He says, trust in Him, not in your own understanding, not in my own understanding. We have to trust Him. In our day and age, we have a constant desire and appetite for information, to figure things out, right? However, I'd say in doing that, it's very much a lame attempt on our part to gain some sense of mastery of our lives. It gives us control. If we feel like we have the information, then we have the control. And that couldn't be further from the truth. So what does the world have to offer? What does Satan have to offer if we go down that path? An endless series of problems? As soon as one problem is figured out, another one comes along. How many times have you experienced that? Got over that, figured that out, and then right behind it, you haven't even had time to sit down and rest. The next thing comes along. That's life. That's what happens. And any relief that we get from that is short-lived. It doesn't last at all. In fact, I don't know if it's true or not. I don't necessarily think it is, but there's the common expression of everything comes in threes, right? So I don't know if it's true or not, but it certainly feels that way. Okay, just when we've gotten through one thing, something comes right after it. But we all know that the relief is short-lived. Solomon, who all of us know, was deemed to be the wisest man that's ever lived. But he himself thought that he could, just in his desire to understand, he could find his way to peace. So even Solomon thought that. He had vast understanding, but it still resulted in a sense of futility rather than fulfillment. We all know, or those of us that know about Solomon, know that he finally succumbed to this, lost his way, and ended up following the idols of his wives. So he knew, right? He had an understanding, but he still did not do what he knew God wanted him to do. God's peace is not an elusive goal at all. It's not one that is hidden in some complicated maze or some kind of deep ancient ritual. Okay, it's not elusive by any means. Actually, if we are following God and walking with Him and are in His presence, we are always surrounded with His peace. And as we look to God and we enter into His presence and are in commune with Him, we gain this awareness. I just want to share some verses that speak to this. Proverbs chapter 3, verses 5 through 6. Trust in the Lord with all your heart and do not lean on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge Him, and He will make straight your paths. In Romans chapter 5, verse 1, it says, Therefore, since we have been justified by faith, we have peace with God through our Lord Jesus Christ. And lastly, in 2 Thessalonians chapter 3, verse 16, the Apostle Paul wrote this, Now may the Lord of peace Himself give you peace at all times and every way. The Lord be with you. So point number 2 again is, God is infinite in His wisdom, beyond our finite understanding. And point number 3 is, God is perfect in love. I looked up the word perfect in the dictionary. Actually, I didn't look it up in a dictionary. I looked it up at dictionary.com, since I don't think I actually have a paper dictionary anymore. The definition for perfect is this. It says, excellent or complete beyond practical or theoretical improvement, exactly fitting the needs in a certain situation or for a certain purpose, entirely without any flaws, defects, or shortcomings. When we typically think of perfection or the definition of perfection, we think of the latter part of that definition, right? So without flaws or without defect. And while that does apply in this case, it's not the entire definition. I was really drawn to the middle portion of that definition where it says that exactly fitting the need in a certain situation for a certain purpose. God is perfect in love. His purpose for us is perfect. It exactly meets our needs in every situation and for a specific purpose. So he comes to us, he meets us where we're at, and his love is perfect. It seems to me that there's a natural reaction in tough times in my life and in our lives to not feel God's love for us or for me. In fact, I have often questioned his love for me. Many times I've felt abandoned by God, even felt like I was being punished by God. It seems that the more I have grappled with God's sovereignty, I have found myself questioning God's love. Again, like I said before, that fight sometimes we have within our minds as far as how can a sovereign God also be a benevolent and loving God. It is, if he is completely in control and so powerful to be able to assert his will, why then is he allowing all this stuff, all these bad things to happen? As humans, it's not natural for us to accept a God that is both sovereign and loving at the same time. It doesn't seem to make sense in our mind. At least it doesn't make human sense. And it seems that we have such a need to be able to explain things. In fact, prominent British atheist, philosopher, and author Richard Dawkins examines this very point in his book, The God Delusion. He asks the same question: how does a benevolent and loving God allow so much pain and suffering to occur? He actually goes so far as to blame world hunger on religion itself, which is ludicrous. But nonetheless, the subject is valid and it's discussed worldwide, whether you're an atheist or whether you're a Christian sitting here at Grace this morning. It's one that's constantly pondered and discussed. In fact, I found myself at times tempted to believe in a sovereign God who is not good all the time. Even Satan himself questioned the goodness of God, and no doubt he uses this to tempt us to believe that God is up in heaven mocking us from time to time when we're in distress. But I'm here to tell you that the good news is that we are not forced to choose between a God who is sovereign and a God who is good. On almost every page of the Bible, we see example after example of God's goodness and sovereignty existing on the same page and in the same situation. Consider a few of these passages. In the book of Psalms, chapter 145, verses 3 through 9, it says, "Great is the Lord and most worthy of praise. His greatness no one can fathom. One generation commends your work to another. They tell of your mighty acts. They speak of the glorious splendor of your majesty, and I will meditate on your wonderful works. They tell of the power of your awesome works, and I will proclaim your great deeds. They celebrate your abundant goodness and joyfully sing of your righteousness. The Lord is gracious and compassionate, slow to anger, and rich in love. The Lord is good to all. He has compassion on all he has made." God's mighty acts of sovereignty, abundant goodness, and compassion not only coexist together, but make him worthy of our praise. It's amazing that we have a God who exhibits both of those, both the benevolence and a sovereignty. Romans chapter 5, verse 8 says, "But God demonstrates his love for us. While we were still sinners, Christ died for us." God's ultimate act of sovereignty, in fact, demonstrated his ultimate act of love for us. In Colossians chapter 3, verse 12, it says, "Therefore, as God's chosen people, holy and dearly loved, clothe yourselves with compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience." God's sovereignty is evident in this to his chosen people who are dearly loved by him. In Romans chapter 8, verse 32, it says, "He who did not spare his own son, but gave him up for us all, how will he not also among with him graciously give us all things?" Think about that. He who did not spare his own son, but gave him up for us. In this verse, and in this book, Paul challenges us with this rhetorical question in this verse. Could God's greatest act of sovereignty in the life of his own son possibly be out of anything but love for us? No, obviously not.